Уважаемые коллеги, дамы и господа, я рад приветствовать вас на...
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to welcome you on this global conference, Effective Global Governance. Maxim Stanislavich Areshkin, who joined us as well and will be one of the speakers at our opening session. So the second time we just meet the second line, the second format, so it's online, and with all the negative points of this format, online format, we can see positive points and availability and attainability. So a year ago we evaluated the losses, human losses, 35 million. And economic, almost 5% of reduction of GDP. So then this is unprecedented. So the forecast of the development of the second wave is a pessimistic scenario. Now we're just going through the fourth wave of the pandemic. And so the number of the sick, more than 50 million, and certainly is unevenly because the poor countries suffer most, and the vulnerable groups of population. And at the same time, so it's my impression that the situation is more difficult from the viewpoint of duration of time. But many economists, especially developed economists and developing economists, so Russia is one of the developed economists, so showed signs of being able to handle the situation. So the losses are horrible, but the forecasts originally were even worse, and that is why we need to recognize that. So then the implementation of the beneficial forecast by 6% by 2020, about 5% 2022, and guaranteeing sustainable growth now depends on the rates of vaccination, ability of the governments to hold adaptive monetary policy, hold down the inflation, and support the labor markets in spite of the most important collective decisions, including the initiative on the accelerating to the access to fight COVID, and this sustain the stop raising the servicing of the debt, and so then the divide of the vaccine resources is huge. And so then this is why if developed countries in different estimates invest about 30% of their GDP in the economic revival, then the average level countries only 6.5%, and low developed countries about 2% in the revival of their economies. In the assessment of OECD, so the revival of the economies of the Big 20, so the volume of investments, the climatic effect is about $36 billion, and the negative impact almost the same. And that is why, so then the divide is growing. So then the risks of attaining sustainable development goals are under risk, and and vis-a-vis the Paris Climate Agreement. So there's among these risks, the representatives of the Big 20 and the Italy, so then uprooting the poverty and encouraging the flourishing of the nations in change of climate. And so the Committee of the Russian Federation spoke that it is the poverty which is the main threat for Russia, and this is the priority in our social and economic policy. And in spite of the criticism of international financial institutions, it's obvious that attaining sustainable development goals, and we need to join efforts and include international organizations. 2022, the Big 20 managed to overcome some implications of the pandemic, and that became the basis for the adaptation and strengthening of the health system and support of the economy, increasing labor opportunities and creating more jobs. So then the green agenda is yet another issue, another topic that we need to pursue and discuss. So what's interesting is that simultaneously with the pandemic, so then the sustainable development goals and the topic of low carbon world have come to the top of the agenda. Those who thought it was thought up and artificial now just are moving over to those who think that this problem is quite serious and advanced. And it is my understanding that the follow-up discussion of these two topics, these two subjects, the pandemic and the sustainable development goals, so we need to be intertwined. And that's why the pandemic may stay in the way of the sustainable development goals, but the task, we need to look at it differently. So we need to how fight the pandemic can complement the SDG goals, because the anti-crisis policy we can always bring into play for the sake of the positive results. So we need just to compromise and just to join forces and combine these efforts. And this is the main challenge that faces us as the mankind. So we have fantastic, wonderful, recognized participants. Session is very saturated and interesting, but our first speaker is Paul Mcgregor, Paul Mcgregor, National Coordinator and Chair, T20 Italy Executive Vice President, Italian Institute for International Political Studies. So first, I'd like to congratulate you for your work in T20, and so that your productive, excellent work, and our academia has been involved since the beginning of the work, and so then under the chairmanship of Russia at T20. And so the key challenges so on the verge of the upcoming summit of the G20.
Об изменении климата. Могли бы вы поделиться вашими оценками, достигнутыми и ожиданиями в отношении предстоящих решений? И какие наиболее важные рекомендации экспертное сообщество, которое вы сейчас координируете, выработало для лидеров двадцатки на предстоящем саммите? You're welcome. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Mao.
Спасибо, профессор Мао.
Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо РНЭПа за организацию этой международной организации вместе с нами, с координацией СИСПИ. И я также рад видеть очень много друзей, знакомых лиц в программе, которые фактически помогли нам работать в течение последнего года. И вот эта своевременная инициатива через неделю после саммита и несколько недель глобальный саммита Большой Двадцатки. Теперь я хочу поделиться, какой процесс происходит в последнее время, особенно по теме этой панели. И как вы совершенно правильно сказали, Владимир, изменение климата является самый большой вызов за последнее время, потенциально больше, чем даже COVID-19. Потому что распространение ковида рано или поздно, это это вопрос времени. А вот глобальный останется, а пандемия справится, а скорость изменения климата подчеркивает необходимость полностью тщательного многостороннего ответа и реакции на это. Чья ответственность конкретно? Кто отвечает в Большой Двадцатке за изменение климата? Почти 90% глобальной ВВП, 2/3 всего мирового населения, 80% выброса парниковых газов, это как раз это Большая Двадцатка. Это все на более Большой Двадцатке. Что сделала Большая Двадцатка до настоящего момента? Давайте посмотрим. Существенный вклад был, конечно, сделан в 2015 году в Турции. Потом в этом случае мы говорим о том, что лидеры
More recently, despite declaration on the reduction of greenhouse gas emission as soon as possible, more recently, frankly speaking, no major result had been achieved until 2019. Last year, the G20 Saudi presidency placed safeguarding the planet as a pillar of its mandate and focused on two main aspects: the importance to mobilize sustainable finance, one, and the circular carbon economy platform based on 4 Rs: reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. So important declaration laying the ground for future steps, but still no concrete commitment on key issues such as decarbonization and phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. My second point, against this legacy, where does the Italian G20 stand? Planet is one of the 3 Ps of Italy: people, planet, and prosperity. Apparently, today's international context seems to favor a positive evolution of climate policies. The U-turn of the United States on climate policies with the Biden administration, the recent commitments on carbon neutrality by key emitters like China, the renewed effort made by the European Union through its Fit for 55 package. On top of that, the higher frequency of extreme weather events and the rising awareness in the public opinion worldwide are making, as you said, Vladimir, climate change a burning issue, an issue G20 leader can no longer escape from. In its Energy and Environment Ministerial meeting in July, The G20, the Italian G20, tried hard to move beyond the legacy of past presidencies and to raise the bar of the ambition. Here are some key pledges and commitments. One, the impact of climate change will be much smaller if the increased global temperature is contained within 1.5 Celsius rather than 2. Second, the link between energy production, greenhouse gas emission, and climate change calls member states to undertake a transition to clean and renewable energies. Third, there is a link between climate change and global inequalities that needs to be tackled. Fourth, 100 billion per year until 2025 to assist countries in adaptation measures. To be honest, a similar commitment was made between 2013 and 2029, but only partially fulfilled, 440 billions out of 700. Now bigger efforts are needed. Fifth, a considerable share of national recovery and resilience plans should be dedicated to mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Sixth, a sustainable finance working group has been established. Seventh, upon request of the G20, the IMF approved an unprecedented 650 billion SDR emission, which also aims to support green transition in developing countries. The G20 ministers have been discussing many other issues, but simply put and frankly put, we are still in the realm of mere declarations. My third point, are we, the T20 community, acting as the ideas bank of the G20, happy with results so far? Our main recommendation for the G20 have been, first, set up a common international taxonomy to facilitate green investment. Second, a commission to accelerate the implementation of capacity building for workers adversely affected by energy transition. Third, we strongly support carbon border adjustment mechanism, which however should not hamper trade rules. And most importantly, the think tank community asks for further commitment to encourage decarbonization and phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Unfortunately, this last recommendation remains unheard, as no consensus has been achieved by the G20 to set a date to phase out coal and stop international public financing of coal power generation and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. My last point, in view of the G20 summit, is a compromise on these two contentious issues possible? Let's be optimistic, but also very pragmatic. Most G20 members, only India, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia are still missing, undertook ambitious long-term decarbonization goals, but we know that in some cases, CO2 emissions are set to remain on the upward path over the next year. They actually increased in 2021, as recently indicated by research. Also, other G20 countries are much more cautious on the pace of their energy transition, since revenues from fossil fuels are still vital to their economies. So all in all, and my conclusion, the G20 glass can always be seen as half empty or half full, but at least we know better now what it takes to fill this glass, and the G20 has tried hard to do its part. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Paolo, and I wish you all the best in forthcoming G20 meeting and your contribution to it. Теперь у меня
Now I have a question to Maxim Oreshkin, who is with us in this audience. So aid to the President of the Russian Federation. So the question, so this low carbon development now is one of the priorities in Russia. And so then last week, the government set the initiative strategic development and the budget for the next 3 years was submitted to the government implementation of the ECG goals. And yesterday, the president considered that, and the energy summit spoke about that, about the ECG and achieving the carbon neutrality. And I would like to ask you to share with us of the approaches Russia to achieving sustainable development goals and the ESG goals, both at macro and micro levels. Thank you very much. Let me start to respond to what you have said in your introductory word. Usually, so the topic of sustainable rejuvenation and in 2021 and other and down the road several years of the global economy and other countries. So this is a positive story just for the economic policy of the world. It's good. So the way. So because the crisis was one of the deepest, and at the same time the recovery seems to be quite fast. And so we have learned to work with the basic economic policy principles and the stimuli that were applied in the world. They were not properly structured. The motivation, that's why there's a big disbalance of those motivations. So that's breaking the supply chains. Some places the demand grew faster and some grew slower. And from the viewpoint of economic policy, so then we need just to manage the structure of demand of the global economy. And so the more we move forward, then the more we involve the fiscal channels from the viewpoint of the main instrument of economic motivation and the revival of the economy. So we need just to properly structure the demand as well. So then I will. So then the last but not least, so then the pandemic subject. So there's a lot to be done because coronavirus is with us forever, and as we see it in the last years, it's been mutating. It will continue to mutate, and so many people get sick globally, and that means that this understanding of the fact that the fight of the mankind with the virus will continue in different forms and shapes. So that's creating mechanisms of continuous changing of vaccines, updating the vaccines so that we could just catch up with the mutations of the virus that will inevitably take place. And that seems to be done. So the mankind needs to develop the systemic mechanisms of the way we'll live together with the coronavirus. So the second point that we discussed yesterday at the Energy Week, and so when the president spoke, so that the stability of the energy markets, because we see so what happened. So then what were the implications and the wrong steps that have been made so far, and what the results are. And so the president appealed to the direct dialogue with the European Commission. And so very soon we'll get the response and the readiness to discuss the energy and the climate problems on a professional level, professional dialogue, because we need to take these steps short term and mid term as well, and long term as well. And we know that the energy and climate. So that's not the thing of separate countries. It belongs to the global community, and so energy and green agenda. So they need to be intertwined. And so just working on a little island, you cannot address this issue. That's why working on it together, just putting together different strategies, we can achieve sustainable development goals. And then another little point of the big problem that you touched upon, if we remember, so the speech of the president of the Russian Federation in Davos last year. So it's not only the poverty problem, but the social divide is another issue. And so it has exacerbated recently globally, and without addressing this issue, so we cannot talk about sustainable development. If we get to the climate issues, it is obvious that for Russia, so the global warming is even a bigger problem than for many other countries of the world, assuming that the warming goes much faster, because we see that it happening, and it is manifested much more openly than in the world. So there are problems with the Arctic zone, and so the cities that were built on the permafrost. And there are many related problems, and because Russia treats the climatic problem very seriously, and so then I would like to appeal to those and speak about that it's a interplanetary problem, and the solution may be found only in joint efforts. It's a global approach is required, so need to get together and find jointly correct answers. What you see, because our desultory activities, so they're not efficient. Disparate activities are not good, because many countries, so they are involved in PR of this problem, and the real problem is hidden behind beautiful words. And many in the world think that the European Union is an example, a classical example of the green agenda. So I got the statistics about the emissions of the greenhouse gases are expected within the next 10 years. So the European Union plans to emit 34 billion tons of greenhouse. Russia is only half, 18 billion greenhouse gases tons than the EU. And so that's why we are concentrating on this story with the announcing this carbon neutrality. Now it's 2060, but I would like to say that so what's important, what's going to happen until 2050, 2060, what will be happening? So in Russia, so we know that the EU will impact nature from the viewpoint of the amount of greenhouse gases twice worse than what Russia will be doing over the same period of time. So then certainly with if the EU really takes care of the green agenda, they need to be much more ambitious in cutting down their emissions. That's good, because we forgot where these greenhouse gases were accumulated, where they came from, and where they accumulated from. So they came from. And then another climate problem, which is very important, is a global approach. The mankind, I think it would be a good idea for the mankind to consider all these opportunities that we have from the viewpoint of emission of greenhouse gases. And but because we always concentrate for some reason, so the changes in energy agenda, although we see that the impact, adverse impact, is very small in the energy sector. It would be better just on the global level to compile some kind of a rating of possible activities, actions of the mankind from the viewpoint of efficiency of invested money and the volume as related to the volume of greenhouse gases emitted. So, for example, if we say that the fighting with, for example, so then the reduction of the area of forests in the Latin America, or the implementation of the climatic projects in Russia and other countries, it's much more efficient than investing in renewable sources. So this strategy of Europe, is it connected with the wish to get some economic technological advantages, or is it just taking care of the climate? And I think it looks like the former rather than the latter. And that is why, so that there is import replacement of energy. It's not fighting for the better climate. I think that the whole world, the whole planet, need to think what in reality and what could be done in the most efficient way to take care of the accumulated amount of greenhouse gases, because lots of green gases have already been accumulated. I say we need to break this trend and think of ways to do it. So then the total register of the projects and both so with the use of natural ecosystems and increasing energy efficiency all over the world, plus the energy component. So we all need to arrange them and invest into the project that give maximum result. As far as energy sector is concerned, so then there have been attempts to replace the definitions, because there are official data, scientific data that testify that the carbon footprint of nuclear energy is 4 times less than solar energy. So that's why if you replace nuclear for solar, so this process increases the greenhouse gas emissions, because nuclear is 4 times less than solar. And at the same time, the energy sector, so we need just to find sources of energy that produce the minimum amount of carbon footprint. So in Europe this year, so the reduction of the generation on the windmills resulted in increasing the demand for the reserve sources of energy. And the reserve source of energy is most of the time is coals. And the renewable energy always should be considered in connection with the renewables, with the balancing power of other energy sources. If it's coal, which can replace coal, then gas generation might be much less toxic, and the carbon footprint is not as bad as the combination of renewables plus coal. And thus you need just to look at it comprehensively. And if we put, as the order of the day, change the level of greenhouse gases and the green footprint, then Russia has ambitious tasks and goals here just to work along these lines. And I think that Russia's goals are much more ambitious than in Europe, because we not only set the goal of carbon neutrality, but we're saying that the accumulated greenhouse gases will be less within the next 10 years than in the European Union. Because Russia actually emits twice as less as the European Union, and Russia is very actively implementing the programs that, in our view, so generate immediate effect. And
from the point of view of net emission indicators of greenhouse gases, and we have many projects in the on use of the methane and the gas and the upgrade of the Russian energy that gives us the better utilization ratio and reduce the emission of the greenhouse gases. And fighting the forest fires program is getting higher financing next year, and the climate project and are a key story, and we need to talk about not just about transformation of power sector from the climate point of view, but the project on sustaining carbon neutrality from the point of view of natural system and saving it's a target of saving the whole humankind. So it's a set of stories that are actively developing in Russia in the logic of maximum effect for the climate for each ruble invested. So I certainly appeal everyone to follow that logic, because it's the specific practical steps, and that's what the that's what people need. Yes, thank you very much. I hope that everything you say is going to be put into practice, because it's a real challenge, and I believe it is a part of this wide agenda. And now let me turn to Annette Kirby from International Monetary Fund, resident representative to Russia. And so speaking about the latest evaluation of growth forecast, how do you see the collaboration for achieving the sustainable development goals, and how would you estimate the IMF suggestions in view of the upcoming G20?
Alexandrovich, for inviting us to this discussion on a green recovery. I think in the interest of time, we don't have very long, I will focus my remarks on carbon pricing and specifically this carbon price floor. I mean, this topic matters to us at the International Monetary Fund because of the devastating effects of climate change. I mean, this is becoming increasingly evident. And it poses huge risks to the functioning of world economies. Temperatures have hit record highs this year in Central Asia, Canada, the US, and as Maxim Stanislavich said, in Arctic Russia as well. In Arctic Russia specifically, temperatures have risen 2.5 times higher than the global average. So obviously, without mitigation policies, physical risks from global warming, such as heat waves, floods, droughts, will increase substantially. I mean, the evidence is clear on this, deterring greenhouse gases, deterring the use of fossil fuels to reduce the buildup of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere is paramount. While there's no one-size policy for countries and how they should approach this, there is an emerging consensus that carbon pricing is the most important policy tool to meet our objectives. Carbon pricing, by making polluting fossil fuels more expensive than clean energy, creates incentives for households to move from high carbon intense activities to low carbon intense activities. And a higher price on fossil fuels also makes green technology much more attractive, much more profitable in terms of investing in. And of course, it encourages improvements in energy efficiency. To meet the stated goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is to restrict global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut in the order of 1/4 to 1/2 by the end of this decade. And this is unlikely to happen without measures equivalent to a carbon price of around $75 per ton by the end of this decade. I mean, we have a long way to go. There's been some progress. There's around 60 national and subnational arrangements around the world, with prices ranging from below $5 a ton to 25 euros in the EU, to $125 per ton in Sweden. Nevertheless, the average global emissions price is only $3 per ton, and 4/5 of emissions remain unpriced. A lot of governments are taking small steps to reduce emissions, but are reluctant to go faster until other countries move faster, because they risk losing industrial competitiveness. This is simply the truth. Thus, carbon pricing needs to be coordinated internationally. Countries can't go it alone. The quickest and the most drastic way to reduce emissions is by creating an international carbon price floor arrangement among major emitters, and this is something we at the IMF have been proposing and pushing to complement the Paris Climate Agreement. And we've proposed how this might work. And our proposal has 3 crucial elements. I mean, the first, because of the urgency to act, it would focus on a small number of countries, a small number of large emitters, and this would basically ease negotiations. And as Paolo mentioned in his intervention, if the G20 were to get together and implement this carbon pricing floor, it would cover 80% of emissions. If it only included the six major emitters, it would still cover 64% of global emissions. Second, the arrangement would be anchored on a minimum carbon price, a single parameter that would be very easy to kind of coordinate and simultaneously act across countries. Third, and this is a point that I really want to emphasize, the carbon price floor agreement should be flexible and should be equitable. It would account for different responsibilities across countries, with different pricing based on development levels, based on countries' national approaches to climate change. And we find that an international carbon price floor is strikingly effective. Just to illustrate with some numbers, a price floor of 2030, a price floor by 2030 of $75 for advanced economies, and $50 for high income emerging countries. These are countries such as China, and $25 for low income countries, or low income rather, emerging markets such as India, would keep global warming below 2 degrees with just 6 participants. I mean, this would be Canada, China, the EU, India, the UK, and the US. And other G20 countries would simply meet their current Paris pledges. And I want to be clear that a carbon price floor doesn't necessarily mean carbon taxes per se. I mean, while of course taxes are indeed an efficient mechanism to reach our goals, in some countries they will be a hard sell politically because ultimately they mean higher energy prices for the entire population. And in this instance, a carbon price floor could be designed by using other measures that might be more politically palatable or might be more in line with what countries choose as their national approach. For example, this could include things such as emissions trading, or a combination of fee-based regulations at the sectoral level. I mean, this would still go some way to achieve the same reduction in emissions. In addition to drastically cutting emissions, an international carbon price floor would have 2 additional effects. I mean, first, it would help build domestic and international support for climate change. On the domestic front, carbon revenues can be raised to help secure a fairer transition for those that are left behind by this global energy transition. And here we have in mind things like compensating households for price increases and helping businesses move from high carbon intense sectors to low carbon intense sectors. On the international front, a carbon price floor will be much less divisive, much less divisive, and much more effective than unilaterally imposing border carbon adjustment taxes. I mean, these mechanisms are otherwise emerging as some jurisdictions move ahead with more ambitious climate goals. The EU announced such a proposal in July, and other countries are also considering this approach. But to be clear, border carbon adjustments and effectively taxes on the carbon content of imports are insufficient instruments. The carbon embodied in trade flows is typically less than 10% of countries' total emissions, and they simply don't cover emissions from domestic uses such as power generation or transportation. Thank you. Over to you, Vladimir Alexandrovich.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more speakers. У нас еще 2 выступающих и 16.
We have 2 more speakers and only 16 minutes of time left. So please make sure you stay within your time slot. Question to John Catton. And the next presenter, founder, director of a research group of G20 from Canada, Toronto University. John, you're researching the matters of global governance. What are the systems of global governance that are the most relevant and acute, and what are the challenges, and how do you evaluate the opportunity to coordinate practical decisions at the G20 upcoming summit? And from the point of view of framework, UN Convention on Climate Change. So we're continuing this discussion on climate. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, the only one that really matters in the world of global governance is the global governance of climate change, as all of our previous speakers have properly emphasized. So when our G20 leaders meet at Rome, they must agree to do 5 things, starting with finally keeping their past promises, then taking a few new easy steps. So first, end fossil fuel subsidies, as they promised to do way back in 2009, repeated it many times, but they still haven't complied. If they did, this single step would reduce carbon emissions by over 1/3, so says the International Monetary Fund, 1/3 of the problem solved right there. Properly pricing fossil fuels would save their hard-pressed members, taxpayers, treasury, and people almost $6 trillion and save almost 1 million lives a year. It would enhance income equality, cut corruption, and preserve nature and biodiversity. So with such immense benefits, no one can now claim that such subsidies are, quote, efficient, end quote, in any way. One way to do it is to set a date, 0 subsidies by 2025. Promises about 2060, 50, even 2030 are largely feel-good fairy tales. The science says we've only got about the next 4 years. They should explicitly ban producer as well as consumer subsidies and eliminate those for the most polluting fuels first, kill killer coal before it kills us. And the reference price to identify a subsidy should not be the cost of production, Saudi Arabia, but the cost of destruction for the ecology, economy, polity, and people's lives. Second, as our previous speakers have properly said, provide climate finance to developing countries of at least $100 billion a year, and maybe pay your arrears as well. Again, this was promised long ago, repeated many times, but still has not been complied with. It's almost 2 years overdue. So G20 leaders at Rome should promise to provide and then write the check from the public purse, what the private sector still won't do, and incentivize or force it to finally pay its fair share. Where will the money come from? Well, our COVID-specific spending is now starting to shrink. They could channel their unneeded share of the $650 billion from the new IMF special drawing rights to the poor countries most devastated by climate change. And if you need more money, the money they save from stopping fossil fuel subsidies can easily finance the rest and more. So 1/3 of the problem solved. The second 1/3 of the climate crisis can be solved by nature-based solutions to support the sinks that suck the carbon out, distinct from the emissions sources that send them up. So third, make and keep a promise to grow 1 trillion trees in the next few years. This is a low or no cost natural technology that's proven its worth for many millennia. It provides carbon mitigation and adaptation through shade. Biodiversity is homes for living things, cultural diversity, and survival for indigenous people who live there too. Food from fruits and nuts, medicines and jobs. So they should start by stopping the unnatural forest fires proliferating now, as those living in Canada and Russia know all too well, replacing the trees they have burnt and adding 1 trillion more trees, especially where land is abundant and heat is extreme. Africa, the hottest continent, and other developing countries are already leading here. And even Donald Trump, as US president, thought this was a good thing to do. Fourth, preserve peatland. Stop draining and destroying peatlands and burning highly polluting fuel for peat. Peat absorbs many times more carbon than trees, but it's disappearing too. And here the Russian Federation and its next door neighbor, Canada, are the world's leading peatland superpowers, so they should lead. Fifth, save the oceans. They have saved us so far by absorbing most of our excess heat, but they can't do that anymore. So preserve wetlands and mangroves at their shores and make at least 30% of their oceans natural protected areas where fish, whales, and other living things can live and breed. Then at Glasgow, a day later, they should say that 1.5 degrees post-industrial temperature rise is the only livable limit, that their nationally determined contributions will reach it finally, as they certainly didn't at Paris, that they will do more each year as the science dictates, and that they'll implement their promise and conduct serious monitoring, verification, and reporting annually to ensure that they all do. And finally, they should agree to hold and attend a UN climate summit every year starting now, as climate change won't stop for the next 5 years until the next scheduled UN COP 27 comes along. After Glasgow, there is a lot more to do, and several of our speakers have mentioned a few of the key points. One, of course, is to price carbon globally. And here I'd be interested in Annette's thoughts about, well, Canada does it. Our next door neighbor, the European Union, does it. But our two biggest neighbors here in Canada, the Russian Federation, and the United States, largely to the south, doesn't have a national carbon price. So how can we get them to join the club? Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker, наш следующий и завершающий выступающий.
And our final speaker for the president of the Global Solution Initiative, Mr. Snower. So all countries share the goals of sustainable development and Paris Agreement, that the priorities are the same, but the conditions are different. And that as much as we talk about the inequality issues, we still see that inequality is getting stronger. What is your feeling about the efficient building of cooperation with this growing inequality? Can digitalization become a factor of sustainability and reduction of this inequality? Or it's just the other way around, the digital gap, the digital divide is growing larger, and we don't yet understand how to overcome it. So the floor is yours.
I'm delighted to be speaking in this group, and I'm also very pleased to be speaking after the previous speakers who have given an excellent understanding of how we should proceed. And that allows me to take a totally different stance to the problem. We know what the problem is. We know what we need to do on a national level in order to address the problem. But so far, we have made totally inadequate progress as a world community to actually doing what we know is absolutely important and right for the planet as a whole. And so the question that I would like to ask at this point is, how do we induce populations in the developed and the developing world to understand the need for immediate climate action, regardless of what their circumstances are, and offer the base of support and urgency that politics usually needs in order to mobilize. So if we know what to do and we're not doing it, then the question we ought to ask is, why are we not doing it, and how can we make people willing and able to push the process along? And this involves not just top-down decisions, but also bottom-up. After all governments are concerned with the will of their people, and the people do not will adequately the climate change priorities which we have been talking about. So what is it that we need to do in order to start a multilateral process along the lines that has been described so excellently? Provide bottom-up support from civil society for the tasks at hand. And I think this particular problem has been analyzed in great detail in other fields. And we know under what circumstances people of different nations and cultures can get together to pursue a common cause. We know the principles that they employ when they're successful, and we know what happens when they are unsuccessful. And let me go through some of the main principles that lead to successful management of public goods and the commons at every level, at regional levels as well as global levels. And they are basically summarized by Ostrom's, Elinor Ostrom's core design principles. She won the Nobel Prize for this, but has received lamentably little attention in both the policy world and in the economic world. So translating her ideas into what we need here, which I would like to specify as not simply a focus on carbon emissions and climate change, but we should focus on all three planetary boundaries that have been overstepped of the 9 planetary boundaries that we all know about. And so in addition to climate change, we have biodiversity loss is another area where planetary boundaries have been overstepped. And then the carbon phosphorus cycle has destabilized seriously, and that needs to be corrected as well. So in all these 3 areas, I think we should think about what does the public need, what is needed to make the public willing and able to support the actions that we want at the national level. Because if the civil society doesn't support it, it's not clear where the political support should come from to promote the actions that have just been advocated. So the first principle is one needs solid local identities. And at a national level, that often exists. Some nation states invest a lot in local identities. Second is that the rules that we specify at a global level, they need to be matched to local needs and conditions. So right down to the local level, you need people at the regional, national level, and the local level need to ask themselves what needs to be done at the local level in order for us to meet our global emission goals, and match the rules to the local needs and conditions. So that means, since solving this problem is a huge long-run win-win opportunity, how can we distribute the gains in such a way that these potential win-wins turn into actual win-wins for everybody right down to the local level? Thirdly, those who are affected by these rules, which is virtually everyone, need to participate in the making of the rules. And since the rules have many different levels from the macro to the micro, there is lots of room for local diversity as long as what comes out in the end is adequate to the global goals that we have. So those affected by the rules should participate in the making of them. And fourthly, these rule-making rights at the local, regional, national levels need to be respected by higher levels at the supranational levels. Fifthly, we need to monitor behaviors, and monitor behaviors not just on a national level, but on subnational levels, right down to the local levels. And sixth, you need graduated sanctions and graduated rewards for good behavior, bad behavior, and good behavior, respectively. By graduated sanctions, I mean minor sanctions that escalate, rewards similarly. And these need to be formulated in advance right down to the local level. Seventh, we need accessible low-cost dispute resolution mechanisms right down to the local level. And then lastly, we need polycentric governance, which means that the decision makers at the local level need to be connected to decision makers at the regional level, which need to be connected to the decision makers at the national level, which need to connect at the global level. And this aspect of finding sort of macro-micro coherence across different levels is lamentably ignored in our global problem-solving efforts. And I believe that if we take the proposals that have now been articulated so well and so precisely and work out what this implies, country by country, culture by culture, for groups right down to the local level, and implement these basic rules, then I think we would have a much better chance of giving people a sense of empowerment, that they themselves, with their individual actions, can do something in order to save our planet, and they know what to do, and as well a sense of social solidarity at the appropriate level. Since this is a global challenge, we will ultimately need to see ourselves as a problem, as human beings solving a common problem. And this macro to micro effort and polycentric governance would be an important step in this direction. Thank you very much.
Уважаемые коллеги, друзья, большое спасибо за проведенную.
Dear colleagues, friends, thank you very much for the discussion. We fit in the allowed time, and I don't think that such wonderful exchange of opinion requires any recap. The only thing that I wanted to mention that it is true that we don't. It's very dangerous to consecrate something, right? Because when we concentrate on the climatic ideas, so sometimes they abandon the attempt to achieve other ends like education, social divide, social protection, education, and all these 17 SDG goals. And so we should not overlook that. We should see the forest for the trees. At the same time, the climatic agenda in its full understanding, in its full gamut, is simultaneously is a cohesive gluing factor, because the proper decisions of the climatic issues related to the global governance and related to the solution of other problems, so they morph into SDGs. And that is why we need to approach all these issues in a balanced way and see the whole gamut of challenges that we face. and we should see the forest for the trees. And so now our conference is just beginning, so there'll be much more wonderful introductions and many more speakers participating.
Colleagues, hi. Paola, can you switch on your microphone? And
yes, I got my microphone on, Marina, and I switched my camera as well. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and
I can see
good morning, good evening, whatever. Hello, Marina.
Hello, hello.
I guess all the other panelists are in the are connected. Could I invite them to switch on the camera so we can see each other? I see then Chati Bastri and Sergei Storchak are in
it's
the
myself.
room. Hello, Sergei.
Oh.
And I don't see Hai Hong Gao, and I don't see Gelsomina Vigliotti. Maybe Marina, you have some extra, some news about them?
They have not switched in yet.
Okay, shall we start anyway, and then...
I think so.
Okay, there might be actually problems maybe with the time zone, because I'm sometimes a bit confusing. But anyway, let's start session 1, the challenges of international financial system sustainability. And welcome to everyone. I'm Paola Subacchi. I'm a professor of international economics at Queen Mary University of London at the Global Policy Institute. And I will be moderating this session. And we have 4 participants, 4 speakers today. 2 of them have not connected yet. But I welcome Sergei Storchak, senior banker and deputy minister, the Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation between 2005 and 2020, and Chatim Bashri, who is professor of the Department of Economics at the University of Indonesia, chairman of the PT Bank Mandiri, and former Minister of Finance of Indonesia, and is also the co-chair of the T20 Task Force on International Finance. Welcome, Chatim, welcome, Sergei. I will introduce the other 2 participants when they will switch on and they will be with us. But I would start our discussion with right now, so not to delay the conference. After the opening session on climate, now we focus on finance, and finance again the key words here are sustainability and resilience. And what we could see is sustainability from a financial point of view. So again, to be able to sustain and in particular the fiscal policy and the expansive fiscal policy that was necessary to backstop the COVID crisis, but also sustainability in terms of climate. So again, finance is an important tool to provide to support and to enable the transition that was discussed, the energy transition that was discussed in the previous session. So with that in mind, we will discuss the problems and the issues around sustainability of the international monetary and financial system, but also how we can ensure that we have a resilient system. There are a number of questions. I like to turn to our speaker. We start with Sergei Storchak. And for 5 minutes presentation, initial remarks, and then we will actually engage in a panel discussion and hopefully with contributions from the floor. And I'd like to invite everyone in the virtual room to send their questions or to raise their hands. And, there is a function on Zoom, or if you don't want to switch on your camera and a microphone, just send us your question by using the chat function. But without any further ado, I'd like to invite Sergei Storchak for his 5 minutes initial remarks.
Thank you, Paola. And first of all, I would like to thank those who standing behind the organization of this event for their efforts to start discussing the situation in the international monetary and financial system. So believe me, for many years, this is not really the subject to be discussed during official meetings of governors or ministers of finance. Probably the issue is so touching that no one really wants to be ahead of events. So events meaning that sooner or later we will face big challenges in this system because the laws, the imbalances are being accumulated within the international monetary and finance system. And I am glad that you use this slogan, not simply international financial architecture, which is now became the slogan of G20. And it's very important that the reference to the currency was inside the description of our topic. Because in terms of international relationship, I don't, it's still a question what is more important, currency relationship or financial relationship, meaning the relationship linked to the managing of financial flows. And the second observation is that you're absolutely right, just switching from the sustainability to resilience. For the monetary system, it's more accurate to use the reference to that it needs to be resilient to the both internal and external factors of which can disturb its normal work and normal operations. So where we are, I think we can be frank that saying that the existing system proved to be very resilient to different challenges. It became obvious after the last global financial crisis of 10 years, which took place 12 years ago. Why it turned to be so resilient to the challenges? I think there are a number of very important factors. First, it turned to be very adaptive to the changes around the globe. Second, it turned to be very important that before the crisis, the global community managed to set up just governance body, which turned to be very proactive in reacting to the challenges. I am making reference not only to International Monetary and Financial Committee, which will have a gathering today in Washington, but to the G20, Financial Stability Board, Bank for International Settlements. All these institutions now not only accumulated huge experience in managing the global system, but they tend to be very proactive in fighting the challenges. And another observation which turned to be somehow shadowed during discussions, the fact that in just probably 20 years, a family of public development banks emerging from the non-existence, or at least they were not in huge amounts. Probably colleagues know something about the coalition, which being referred as Finance in Common coalition, which gathered development institutions from all over the world, and a number of these institutions is somehow 400 or 400 plus. So in a week time, the coalition will have its own summit in Rome, and we will find out the final figures, how huge the coalition is. At least when the coalition members gathered last year in Paris, they calculated that the members of the coalition investments, annual investments, stand for 2.3 trillion of US dollars, or 10% of global public and private investments. So the influence of this family is increasing. One particular example of this influence is that the president of so-called long-term investments club, the president of European Investment Bank, were sitting at the table during the governors and ministers meeting yesterday in Rome, and clear references is being made for the first time the history in the minister's financial statement about the role and influence of this coalition and the public development banks in particular. So we have very strange situations. From one side of the story, the family influence is increasing, but the influence of what is going on inside the monetary system is still very small. And there are a number of challenges inside the system, or as Mark Carney in his speech 2 years ago said, there's some, I forgot the concrete English name, but he made reference to one particular story that in the system we have the one dominant currency, and we all know what its currency is. And this is taking place in the situations when the economy of this of issuing country is not a dominant player in the global economy. This is maybe the most serious issue or the most serious challenges to the stability or sustainability of international currency and financial system. So whether we will have the necessary braveness, necessary influence, necessary power to tackle the issue, it's still a big problem. I remember that 10 years ago, there was an attempt by the French president to start the discussions of the situation inside the monetary system. So we gathered in one of the cities in China, but at the end it turned to be that no one really wants to discuss the influence and the position of the US dollar in the system. So probably we need some time to understand whether in the multilateral world can the system still be rely on dominant currency, or we will need a more multiple currency system of international finance and international governance linked to this multilateral support or multilateral conditions. So I stop here. It is not everything I wanted to say, but you see, when you switch from your home language to English, it's especially working on the distance, it's not so easy to find the right words. So thank you for listening to me, and I am ready to answer questions, if any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergey. You put many interesting questions on the table, and we definitely will go back to in our discussion, and we hope to be able to address and discuss at least some of them. And thank you very much. Your English is very good. I can't even think about my switching to Russian, which mine is inexistent. So thank you very much. And now turn to Chatti Basri for his initial remarks. And Chatti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I would like to thank the RANEPA for the invitation as well. Perhaps let me take this opportunity to highlight about two issues, since my time is limited. I understand it's only 5 minutes. One thing that we learned from this pandemic is there is a strong likelihood that we are facing a problem of this uneven global economic recovery. And this has to do with this inequality distribution of vaccines. So let me speak from the perspective of the Asian countries, the emerging economies. Yeah, the implication of this uneven global economic recovery is probably the normalization of this stimulus in the advanced country will occur faster than many emerging economies or developing countries. So one of the risks that many people have been talking about recently is about the repeated or the risk of the tapering 2.0. Yeah, but I will not discuss about this taper tantrum. But one thing that I would like to highlight here, if there is a shock on this global financial market, whether this is triggered by this unwind of this stimulus in the advanced country, one of the biggest problem that many emerging markets are facing is the volatility of the capital flows. So there is a need of this global financial safety net here. Yeah, and in addition to that, Paula, you mentioned in your introduction as well, one of the theme of the fiscal policy all over the world is do whatever it takes. We can see that very high fiscal deficit in many countries to address the pandemic. And there is a risk of the debt distress in many emerging economies. So the financial stability is at risk at this moment because, the thing that we need to anticipate regarding the pandemic. So one of the key issue is whether do we need to extend or expand the global safety net? Yeah. My immediate answer is yes. But unfortunately, it's easier to be said than done. So let me talk from the Asian perspective, from the emerging market perspective. There are several proposals, I believe, that have been discussed and put on the table. The first one is, and I'm very supportive for this, is to increase the SDR for the IMF. Yeah, and this somehow will give a room for the emerging market, in handling this issue, the global financial safety net. The second one is also about this financial arrangement with the IMF. Yeah, and also the other thing is to strengthen the role of the regional financial safety net. Yeah, let me discuss in more. Let me discuss further related to this. This looks very good, and I'm very supportive on this. But in my experience, this is not going to be very easy. Yeah, the reason behind it is if you look at the emerging market, especially the Asian countries, they've been accumulating reserve since long time ago. We are talking about this issue of the saving class, etc. And one of the reasons is they are using this foreign reserve as an insurance. Yeah, and the question is why. Yeah, one thing that is very interesting, at least from my experience when I was at the MOF, we learned that during the financial crisis, because the stigma of the Asian financial crisis in 1998, it's not easy for Asian countries to go to the IMF. Yeah, even though the SDR is there, the financial arrangement for the IMF is there. Yeah, it's not easy. We can look at the experience during the 2008, the global financial crisis. Even Singapore, Korea, they did not go to the IMF for the support, but they went to the Fed to get this bilateral currency swap at that time. Yeah, and the reason behind it, I don't know what is the main reason behind it, but they claim that they are systematically important countries. So that is why they went to the Fed. But one thing that I would like from here is the implementation for this is not easy. That's the first one. The second one, what about the strengthened regional financial safety net? To my experience in Asia, we do have the CMIM, the Chiang Mai Initiative. But unfortunately, this is also untested. Yeah. And when Asian countries got a problem about this financial crisis or financial turbulence, they prefer to go to the bilateral currency swap rather than to the regional financial safety net. So this is the issues that we probably need to discuss and address further. And there is another proposal which seems to me that very interesting is proposed by Colibri and Prasad. Yeah, about the GLIM. The Global Liquidity Insurance Mechanism. And I found this is probably, one of the potential that we probably have to look at to discuss further. Yeah. But one thing that I would like to highlight is the role of this the global financial safety net it's become more important and important in the future. That's the first point. If you allow me to, if I may go to my second point. The other issue that I would like to highlight is the limitation of the policy options that many emerging economies have. Yeah, let me look at the experience during the quantitative easing, the first QE after the global financial crisis back on 1998. The 2008, around 2009, and similar situations is also repeated. Yeah. If we believe, with the so-called the unholy trinity, the impossible trinity, unfortunately, in policy, this is not going to be easy. So let me give an example. Yeah. So when there is a surge of the capital inflow coming into the country triggered by the quantitative easing, if you let the inflow to come, then there is a risk for you to have these inflationary pressures. We are quite lucky at this moment because during the pandemic, on the demand side was pretty weak. Yeah, but during the normal situation, this kind of, there's like quantitative easing. If we allow inflow of money, then can be inflationary. Yeah, if the central bank choose to do the sterilization, its cost is very expensive because we have to pay the spread between the central bank rate and the Fed fund rate. Yeah, and if we allow the appreciation, it's gonna kill our export, the competitiveness. Yeah, then one thing that come into on the table with is probably one thing that has been tried to been avoided in the last 10 years in the discussion of the in the financial integration is imposing capital controls. Yeah, a selective capital controls. We are talking about this macro-prudential, but there is a risk of it. Lose efficiency, have to finance investment through the higher cost domestic. Yeah. So the other option is you use the fiscal policy. You do the fiscal contraction. But this can be a recession. Yeah, will have an impact for the recessionary, and this is politically difficult. So one thing that I would like to highlight here, I think it's about time for us to look at the situation again. Yeah, that's the Mandel-Fleming framework about this, the impossible trinity. Probably in reality, the room for the policymakers are also limited. So one thing that we need to anticipate is how to manage these capital flows. Yeah. Probably we land on the situation that a combination of everything. Yeah, somehow we use the monetary policy, maybe some intervention in the forex market, not to pegging the level, but smoothing the volatility, tighten the fiscal a little bit, do the macro-prudential. But this is something that very new, that probably we have to face in the future. And I think, for the international institution like Bretton Woods, it is very important to discuss about this issue. So Paula, I leave it up here and I'll be happy to continue our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shatib. And I don't think we have the other two participants, the other two panelists, which it's unfortunate because they could actually add to this discussion. Particularly, Gelsomina Vigliotti has been leading the financial track of the G20 this year, and also Hai Hong is involved in the T20, and she would have had extra comments to what you just said, Chatib, on the global financial safety net. But let me go back to our what we just heard, and I think there are two basically main streams from what from your initial comments, Sergei's and Chatib. One is actually the dollar system, and the other one is the multilateral safety net. And I totally agree with you, Chatib, and for the economists in the room, is the Mandel-Fleming model is no longer applicable to a world with capital flow and financial integration, and where developing countries in particular are on the receiving end of any turmoil happening in New York, because we are so integrated. And so back to what Sergey was saying, the problem is not the fact we have a dollar system. The problem is the dollar, the financial system, which is basically led, is a dollar-led financial system, and the capital flows tend to follow the changes in the American monetary policy, which is devised for the domestic market in the United States, but the spillover are huge on particularly on developing countries, but not only in developing countries. Again, Canada is a country which has experienced a lot of spillovers from the Fed monetary policy. The question is, what do we do? So I would say, like to go back to Sergey, I don't believe that we can change the international monetary system with just reform. And what that was, if you remember in 2009, the issue of having the dollar as the main currency was raised by the then governor of the People's Bank of China. And then, as you said, Sergey, France addressed the issue of the international monetary system in his G20 in 2011. I don't think it's something you can do. You can decide, in a room and have the agreement of everybody, and now we change the system, because the dollar system is very much ingrained in, and we're not going to discuss this here. But what we could do is to cooperate to address the spillovers, in particularly on developing countries and low-income countries, developing countries, mainly the low-income countries, and to strengthen the multilateral safety net. And I like to stress what Chatib said: the safety net must be multilateral. It's not enough, and it's not good enough to rely on bilateral agreements, swap agreements, and they are in place. The Fed got swap agreements in place that are very important. They provide a good support to the financial system, but it's very selective. And so China has put in place a number of swap agreements. So safety net should be multilateral, should be international, and should be also regional. But now we go down to institutions. And so the institution reform, in particular the IMF, and the whole reform of the quota system. So that is a way, if you think, to have a more sustainable and resilient system. So I would like to turn back to you too, Chatib and Sergey, and pick some of this issue. And in particular, Sergey, and if you don't mind, I'd like to take your view. You mentioned development. I'd like to take your view on institutions, and institutions then should provide the global goods in finance, which are the safety nets, but also development finance, and how we can actually use the system we got in a better way to provide more resilience. In other words, how do we foster policy cooperation? I don't know if, Sergey, you want to address these questions, or you want to pick up something else, and then Chatib, if you like, if you don't mind, to also respond to this.
Yes, I would like to go on with the discussion with the role and capacities of public development banks in context not of their general activities, but in the context of the resilience of international monetary and financial system. So these institutions are really good for the system because of their financial policy, or to be more exact, because of their financial model. They borrow on international market, on global markets, the biggest ones, and they lend cheaply, and then in the lending is long-term financing. So these two aspects of their activity helps a lot to stabilize the monetary system by nature of this operation. So, and nowadays we have contrary developments. Just it is not become very much publicly discussed, but G20 already starting thinking what can be done with non-bank financial intimidation sector. This, first of all, it is pension funds and different funds, monetary funds, money, for example, market money funds, insurance companies, which are very often are being referred to as institutional investors. Those group of people working with a huge, with the money accumulated enormous assets. So, for example, the latest figure I know from the Financial Stability Body that the non-bank financial intimidation sector accumulated assets which 30-40% higher or bigger than assets accumulated by commercial banks. But commercial banks are duly regulated, and they are duly regulated on a global level. Multilateral cooperation is huge, very good one. I personally participated in this work, and I was very happy or surprised, both sides, how people were forward-looking and really did very good job. And another story with this non-financial intimidation sector. No common rules. Each jurisdictions have each own rules, and what is being said now in the recently published G20 declarations that situation is going to be developed in the same direction. So each jurisdictions will look at their own non-bank sector and decide by themselves what need to be done. And future multilateral discussion looks that it is being postponed for some time. It's a very interesting development, and from my point of view, it is going to be, this sector can be a trigger for coming the coming financial crisis. So you know, we all know who were the triggers of the previous crisis. Now situation are changing, and it is going to be even more deep and even more difficult to handle because of the specifics of this financial sector. And just I want to quote one single sentence from the recent G20 declarations. It's devoted to both what my colleague said, devoted to the developing countries and their funding policies, and to this intermediary sector. So in the declaration, the ministers say, we look forward to the FSB examining the interaction between US dollars cross-border funding and non-bank financial intimidation-related vulnerabilities in emerging market economies, external finance. So you see, we have two big tendencies: the stabilization role of public development institutions or banks, and very, I wouldn't say it's playing destabilizing role of this intimidation sector, but the volatilities of financial flows are from their behavior. They very easily enter the markets, and they very easily leave the markets the moment they feel the risks are increasing. So the issue is that we, international community, those who are involved in decision-making process, are behind events in discussing the issues, and it have another side of the story. We still lack in the system the comprehensive debt restructuring mechanism or international debt restructuring mechanism. We have a number of narrow instruments or instruments linked to the concrete sector. For example, Paris Club working on the debt come from export credit agency activities or export and trade financing. So we don't have the mechanism which is comprehensive by nature and covers all liabilities. So I stop here. Hope that you understood my position, and I am a bit worried because of you see those who are not in institutions, who are not academicians, they are not really want to pick up the issue, discuss it, at least privately, not in public contents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergey. I think we have an audience here and a group of people who are not academics in the sense that they are in the ivory tower, and we are all very much involved in policy or the policy discussion or even policy making. For what you say, basically, on bringing in Chatib, so there are these portfolio flows, because we are talking mainly of portfolio flows and not so much the FDI, that move freely at the touch of a computer keyboard, and then can be extremely destabilizing. They are very useful because their countries are very happy to receive capital inflows, in particularly when they are very low cost or free, but then they don't have, as Chatib said, the options, the policy options are very limited when the tide moves the other way. And in fact, I just say what Chatib said, basically, either you put capital controls, but that is problematic because you might create a huge turmoil in financial and capital markets, because obviously investors will get extremely concerned. So you might experience even more turbulence by just putting capital controls, and then you basically dry out future flows. Or you have to go for fiscal policy contraction in order, for example, to take inflation under control. So it's very limited. So in other words, developing countries in particular, or what we called innocent bystanders, are at the receiving end of the negative spillovers from big advanced economies and with large financial sectors, in particular the United States, because it's the largest financial sector and the most internationalized. So the policy options are very limited. And you are absolutely right, we need to have an international cooperation, because country on their own cannot do anything. So again, I like to turn to Chatib, is again, the limited action in policy of countries that feel in this situation could be much supported by coordinated action at the international level. And that's what the G20 tried to do, and with successful and unsuccessful outcome, basically. Chatib, I turn to you for a comment, if you want to comment on this.
Thank you, Paula. You pointed out a very important issues, actually, And then before I respond to you, I would like to add one more problem that emerging markets are facing now. As in developing countries or emerging market, it is very common or very logical to run a current account deficit, because we don't have capital. So in order to boost economic growth, we need to import capital. So we run the current account deficit. But exactly what you said, the capital flows coming into the country, and every time the current account deficit higher than 3%, emerging markets are punished by the financial markets, because they don't like to see that country run a current account deficit more than 3%. And that's exactly happened during the the taper tantrum 2013, for example. Yeah. So, but in fact, by nature, developing countries need to grow faster, and they need to run a current account deficit. But the situation is, it's like a catch-22. Yeah, very difficult situation. Now let me come back to your question. What can we do? Yeah, under this kind of situation. Let me talk from the each country perspective, the domestic perspective. I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, would be the policy mix. Yeah, I'm become very pragmatic, based on my experience in the past, become very pragmatic about it. What we did at that time is we tightened fiscal by adjusting the fuel price, for example. The central bank raised the interest rate, but we also let the exchange rate to depreciate in order to, when there is a sort of like reversal of the capital outflows at that time. So combination of everything. And the central bank also intervened the forex market, not to pegging the level, but smoothing the volatility, just to ensure that this will not create a panic. That's probably, individual country can provide the policy on their own. But you are exactly right. There is a need about this international cooperation. But Paula, the problem is, if you are talking about this international economic coordination related to the fiscal and monetary policy, and that's difficult, especially on the fiscal side, because you are talking about this issue of the sovereignty on the monetary side. This is not going to be easy as well. So one thing that at least we learn from the experience, one thing that seems to me that's very useful is we use the G20 as a fora to exchange the view. Yeah, I remember back on 2013 and 14, most of the time we raised the concern about every time the Fed made a decision, at least, we can have an exchange with and communication is very important. It sounds very simple, but in fact it is not. If they can communicate with us, that at least we can prepare, the anticipation. And I have to say, I'm talking again from the experience in the past, the communication has been better, since 2014, and then the Fed started, Yellen, when she was a chairperson of the Fed, she communicate regularly during the G20 meeting about the policy stance of the monetary policy stance. And if you recall, in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, when there was a risk of the trade war and slowdown, on China, they taken into account as well with the Fed's decision. So that kind of model seems to me that's what I call the soft core of this international cooperation. Yeah, and that's doable immediately. So I would like to see, probably, we can use G20 as a forum to exchange. It's probably like OECD. Yeah, it's non-binding, I do understand, but at least, all the policymakers around the table will understand about the situation, and they can anticipate and come up with their own policy. And I found that's very useful. But the most difficult thing is exactly what you said. What kind of policy coordination that we can propose? Whether this monetary, coordination, seems to me this will take some time. When we need to sit around the table, the concerted effort, this is not going to be easy, especially on the fiscal side. Yeah, I don't have the clear answer for this, unfortunately, Paula. This is a $60 million question. Now, I would love to have the answer towards it, because that question, that's exactly the question that I posed a long time ago. We probably need the so-called the international policy coordination, but how? This is not going to be easy.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Chatib. And in fact, we have been working on these topics for a long time. One thing I noticed, as you said, there is a better coordination, better communication. And it's interesting, again, back to Sergei's point at the beginning of his remark, is the dollar dominance. There is is not only the fact that countries run current account deficit and investors, international investors, do not like current account deficits above 3% or 4% or certain threshold, and they get very nervous. It's also true that when the Fed changes its policy and, for example, increase interest rate, then you have a change in the tide, in the sense that international investors, they have basically almost risk-free assets, i.e. the US Treasuries, and they give a better return. So what do? They go back to the US market. That is not the fault of anybody. It's not even a problem with the actual country that the recipient of this flow. It's just how monetary policy works and how the dominance of this monetary policy, obviously what we call the externalities, the spillover from the US monetary policy. And you mentioned the tapering tantrum in 2013, and you are in your role as a finance minister of Indonesia, so you are in the front row of this tapering tantrum. There are lessons there, and in fact the Fed now is much more careful and much more concerned about financial stability, which is not only financial stability of the US market, but financial stability also around the world. As you said, Chatib, having the G20 as a way, as a forum where to exchange views, probably educated some of the policymakers around the table to think not just about their own market, but also think about the spillovers in other countries. We have 3 minutes left in our session, but if you don't mind, I'd like to pick one of the questions from the chat, which is, if I can read it correctly, it's so basically debt is transferred. Basically, poor people and low-income countries are those who suffer most from an increase in debt, because obviously the debt conditions imposed on them are much harsher because they don't have collateral. So and that increase inequality. So this person in the chat, Luciano, asked, what do you think about a debt-free money issued only from the central bank and public authority? So the public authority that issue the money must be accountable and transparent to Congress, which I believe that is obviously Luciano tend to refer to the United States. And in this framework, commercial banks can lend money as an intermediary only, but cannot create money. So I think it's a bit tangled from an economics point of view here. But I think what Luciano would like to ask is basically, is basically a hint to the modern monetary theory. And and I wonder whether either you, Chatib, or Sergey likes to pick this point. So basically, how can we issue debt without penalizing people for the rest of their life? In other words, it is basically, is there a way to issue money in a sort of free way? I don't know. I'm very skeptical about the modern monetary policy theory, but maybe you guys have a different view and different comment.
So the issue, in my sense, the issue is not who is borrowing, who is lending. The issue is how money which is borrowed or procedures are being used in real economic activities. So if borrowed money are being invested in productive assets, it's one side of the story. It means that these assets would produce financial flows which would be enough for servicing the debt and repaying debt back. But what is happening recently, that borrowed money are being used for non-investment purposes. So for social consumption, and in the case of corporate borrowing, for paying dividends, for buying back from the open markets their shares. So, and those famous carry trade operations. So this is the real problem, and this is problem is well known, but in terms of governance or in terms of management, this is very this is where the market forces are much more stronger than who's are responsible for governing the markets. So we'll see how, for example, the biggest, the United States with this huge increase in sovereign debt will go on further in managing, find the right solution between the government, the president, the governance of this country, and the parliament, the Congress. So we understand this always political fight around the debt ceiling, but it is not only the issue of the United States. You see, at some stage, I even tried to use a reference to dollar, that the dollar is global public good. If we can work on this in terms that those who are in charge of power in the United States can hear more to the outside world, can rely more on multilateral policies. So I think we would be able to use the strong side of the dollars for the benefit of the global community, for the global economy. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we are, yeah, and I agree with, Sergey made a very, very good point. Is not who actually lend, but how it is, how lending takes place. And one thing certainly we need to look at is, and again, back to the comments in this panel about the need for an international debt restructuring system, multilateral debt restructuring system. That is certainly the case, but also we need to think how we incur into that, and we need transparency, we need assessment, and there are a lot of things that can be done ex ante to assess the need to take up more debt in order not to be in a difficult situation. I think we are run out of time. There is still an open question, which I will actually leave it for Marina to take up perhaps in next year's conference, and it's the role of capital for development. So we heard about capital flows, we heard about investors investing in developing countries where the returns are higher than in advanced economies markets. But there is, and the issues about the capital flow, the capital movement. But capitals are important for development, and capital are important to help the environmental transition. So how do we make sure that countries that do not have in the immediate those resources can develop, and on the long run pay back their debt, as everybody, as the normal thing to do. And so the role of the multilateral development banks, and it would be, again, something that obviously we cannot discuss in the session, but it would be very good to bear in mind and perhaps come back in a subsequent conference, and hopefully a subsequent conference to be held in Moscow next year, because we all love to be together in person. This is the second year that Marina has to deal with this online conference. And last year we said we hope to be in Moscow in 2021. It didn't happen. Well, we hope for 2022, and obviously 2022 will be also the year that Indonesia will chair the G20. As an Italian, I feel like a sort of symbolic passage here to chat him for next year G20. So it was a very, very interesting and a dynamic session. I'm sorry for Haihong and Gelsomina for not being with us today. And thank you very much for your attention. And thank you obviously to Chatib and Sergey for their very interesting and valuable contributions. And all the others, all the audience, please join me to virtually thanks our speakers today. Thank you very much. And have a good rest of the day.
Our session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. And
Goodbye.
Bye.
Recording stopped.
Я включила микрофон, но пока очень неправильное видео.
В каком виде?
Ну, как вот было до этого. Вот эта часть, чтобы видна была. Зачем нам весь...
Камера не центрировалась.
Угу. Вот да, примерно так, лучше даже еще немножко поближе. Вот так, наверное, хорошо. Угу. Да, я начну.
Recording in progress.
Dear colleagues, I'm very glad to welcome you to our discussion today. We will hopefully have some insights on cooperation priorities for attaining climate and sustainable development goals. And this is a very timely discussion. Though, of course, we have today plenty of competing very important debates, including in the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But our academic discussion will have, I think, some practical implications. I'd like to first make a short introduction to our discussion of the priorities, because providing some background to this, which of course you know very well, but nevertheless, we know that COVID crisis resulted in unprecedented increase in poverty rates and public debt inequality. And despite a rebound of global growth and some positive collective decisions, such as the special drawing rights allocation and the G20 debt suspension initiative, the risks of failure in achieving sustainable development goals are rising due to inequality in access to vaccines, disparities in policy support, boosting commodity prices and inflation pressures. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns us that the national determined contributions of all parties taken together imply a 16% increase in global greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2010, while we need 45% cut by 2030. UN and global community call for bold actions to be taken immediately to avoid a temperature rise of about 2.7 Celsius by the end of the century. But new ambitious national determined contributions would require support to developing countries, and at that time when they also need finance to fight continuing pandemic and its impact on social and economic development. The OECD estimates that the funding gap to achieve SDGs amounts to 3.7 trillion USD. And the gap for promised climate finance is at least 20 billion. Of course, there are prospects for new resources, including possible voluntary channeling of some of the 650 billion of USD equivalent special drawing rights allocations through the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust to support developing countries' investment in sustainable growth. And of course, digital transformation might act as an enabler of sustainable development. But again, harnessing digitalization for sustainable development would require investment. What should be policy and international cooperation priorities for attaining climate and sustainable development goals in this context of numerous and diverse challenges and scarce resources? We have a panel of distinguished speakers today here with us, and I hope to get some vision and insights from different perspectives. So I would like to first invite David Knight, World Bank lead economist for the Russian Federation, to provide his vision and probably a perspective from the World Bank on what the priorities should be.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually, but still be here. I trust you can all hear me and translation is working well. I'm especially pleased to be here at this conference because of the topic, the sustainable development, and especially sort of foremost in our minds at the moment is the climate change agenda. I think it's increasingly a critical question for the world, and it's a very and increasingly and very much discussed in Russia. I understand there's a number of excellent speakers, so I will not talk for too long to make sure others have time, and I will keep my remarks relatively broad, but happy to engage in some follow-up discussion. When thinking about the priorities for cooperation, I mean, I would highlight sort of three key points, and I can speak to them a bit more. First of all, of course, is the global ambition overall, and the priority, the overriding priority of raising the global ambition of greenhouse gas mitigation to avoid the worst effects of climate change. The second priority is to ensure that within that framework, the global goals are consistent with countries, especially developing countries, successfully pursuing their own national development agendas. In other words, it would not seem reasonable to sacrifice developing countries' development for aims at mitigation, and is unlikely to be successful in that case. And thirdly, the priority of identifying international and multilateral mechanisms for cooperation and coordination. So just a little bit more on these. I think already, you've described very well the ambition, in especially in terms of greenhouse gas reduction targets. In other terms, around the estimated temperature rises, current policies, the last time I checked, are estimated to be associated with temperature rises of around 3%. And the current commitments of all countries around the world still only get us to about 2.4%. So that's in the best case, compared to the international commitment to limit temperatures to increase by 2%. So really more effort is needed, clearly, to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement of limiting temperature rises to 2%, let alone to go beyond it and limit temperature rises even further. So mechanisms like the forthcoming COP in Glasgow are a key part of the international mechanisms to help forge such a more ambitious agreement. And very notable in that respect is the recent announcement, I understand, by the president of increased ambition in the longer term for the Russian Federation. In terms of national development, and this is an area where the World Bank is especially working intensively, given our presence, long-standing and deep presence in countries such as Russia and other countries all over the world. And that is to ensure that the global and national development goals support one another. In some cases, there is certainly a trade-off between sustainable goals and green goals and growth, but it's not always the case, and it's not necessarily the case, especially given the global shifts in demand and the global changes in technology that we're already seeing related to green transition, and that will continue. The dynamic gains from green transition over time may well, and based on evidence, can outweigh the transition costs. However, it is also very important to take these shorter-term transition costs seriously and ensure that in such a transition, policy is designed to ensure that no one is left behind. And my third point was on multilateral and cooperative solutions. And this is really to emphasize that it is important for the global community to support a positive action on the sustainable development and climate change agenda, and especially to avoid a situation where some countries go green and others stay brown, leading to somewhat of a twin-track global economy, which would undermine global targets and would serve no one's interests. And beyond global goal setting, I think there is an important role for international cooperative action here. Border carbon taxes, which help to reduce carbon leakage and create trade-based incentives, are one such instrument to support cooperation, which are much talked about. However, that is only one instrument amongst many cooperative activities and cannot be expected to fundamentally change the course of economic development in trading partners alone. I also wanted to highlight that, in this world we are in and advancing into increasingly rapidly, there is a great deal of uncertainty about the probability and the speed of global transition, and policymakers around the world understandably are struggling to appraise this. In this situation, it's important to produce and share good quality information and analysis as a global public good. Countries, of course, will make their own decisions on what to do, but it should be based on the best evidence and knowledge of the world and what other countries around the world might and are doing. There is also a role for scaling up of financing to support the green transition, both to limit the impacts of climate change and to support measures to mitigate emissions. And I would just, in summing up, also just mention the World Bank's program in this area. The World Bank has announced a new World Bank Group Climate Change Action Plan earlier this year, which supports a scaled up effort across a range of different areas for countries. And in Russia, we are currently conducting a climate change development report with the authorities and other stakeholders, which intends to delve deeply into the relationship between national development and the risks and opportunities presented by climate change and green growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Very important points, and they resonate with what we discussed in the plenary session very much. Like, for instance, the issue of bottom-up support to the global goals, the macro-micro coherence in the climate and development agenda, it should be embedded in the local conditions, of course. And that would bring support domestically, which is extremely important for global success. Our second speaker, Dr. Camilla Bausch, is director of Ecologic Institute, and she is also co-chair of the Think 20 Task Force on Climate Change, Sustainable Energy and Environment. And I would like to give the floor to her now. Camilla, are you with us?
Yes.
Yes.
Let me switch on all the right.
Great. Thanks for a very insightful intervention at the Think 20 Summit. And now David touched upon the different mechanisms like carbon border adjustment mechanism and carbon price floor and others. But of course, these would not be sufficient. What should be the priorities?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you very much. And first of all, since this is a collaboration with Russian institutions, I want to say Приветствую вас, дорогие коллеги из Berlina. I've even taken the right Moskva cup today, so we feel connected. And as you've just said, Marina, it's quite a timely moment to talk about this because the G20 summit in Rome is coming up at the end of the month. We have the UN Climate Summit COP26 coming up in November, and actually the one hopefully serving the other to get, on speed. And these places of multilateral cooperation are of great importance, especially because we are seeing a multipolar world now. it's different than in the past. And coordination for the common good is needed, especially if the challenges are global by nature, as the COVID-19 pandemic you've mentioned, Marina, but as climate change, which has been mentioned by both of you, David and Marina. So where are we with respect to that in 2021, with respect to our multilateral efforts? And before we come to 2021, I want to glimpse back to 2015, just to say that multilateralism actually can deliver, because in 2015, it delivered first the Agenda 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, including some beautiful things like zero hunger, good health and well-being, gender equality, reduced inequalities, affordable and clean energy, and climate action. If we take this and see what's happening right now in the wake of the pandemic, it's actually not always going the right direction, right? And the second thing which we achieved in 2015 as a global community was having the Paris Agreement adopted, and there the objectives the global community is striving towards are defined, and David referred to them. These are basically the temperature limits. So this is our constitution of today, and we take them as the basis for all multilateral efforts. But where are we now? Let me first, since we're a scientific group, also just say that in August, the IPCC report showed that we are moving from prediction to evidence. So what we have predicted as impacts is now evident, and it's unequivocal with respect to the human influence on the climate change issue. And I want to quote, human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. Every region is seeing that, and we obviously in Germany just saw these devastating floods, but others see fires. So this is the reality we face in 2021. So with this in front of us, are we actually living up to the opportunities and to the objectives we have? And Marina and David, you both said we do not. And I can just echo this. We do not, and that has also been shown in numbers by analyses of, for example, the UNFCCC Secretariat or the climate action trackers and many others. So countries definitely need to increase their national emission reduction targets. David, you have referred to that. I agree 100%. And if we think Glasgow, probably in this setting, we should also refer to the 100 billion, which are to be raised by public and private funding to help developing countries to engage in climate protection and also in adaptation efforts. Now, in this, the G20 are of particular importance, being responsible for around 75% of global emissions. So without them, we cannot solve the problem. The presidency of the current G20, so Italy actually took that on, calling their head theme People, Planet, Prosperity. And to actually live up to that, in my view, G20 should commit to net zero emissions no later than 2050 and adjust their strategies and NDCs accordingly and implement. But obviously the Italian presidency is struggling because their success can only build on the will in the room. And let's look at the will in the room. David, you referred to the Russian president just announcing something more ambitious. I'm referring now maybe to old numbers, so please bear with me. Things are moving quite quickly all over the world. But from an analysis of climate analytics of June this year, so again, Russia's pledge was worse than its business as usual. That is not acceptable in this world, I think, which we are facing. But they are not alone. Brazil and Mexico have worse targets than before. China and India have no new NDCs, and I could go on. So I think the G20 are not up for the job yet, and that has to be a priority for all of us, nationally and internationally, to work towards this. There are obviously some good examples, but still. so for a strong signal for Glasgow, the G20 should collectively submit strengthened NDCs, all of them. The G20 presidency also works towards some more specific issues. I can just mention a few, and I picked coal because it's so relevant for climate protection. And they work towards commitment to new coal power, including the phase out of unabated coal with a specific date. I would suggest 2030 for OECD countries. And a phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies with a specific date. Some suggested 2025. And I would say it's not only inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, but actually fossil fuel subsidies. But that is up for negotiations. And as has been mentioned by the presidency after the Climate and Energy Summit, Ministers' Summit they had, they are not there yet. There was a lot of agreement in the room, but not full consensus. So that, and now, Marina, you kind of implicitly said this. This means different things for different countries. It means something very different for Russia than it means for Germany. It depends on how much you depend on coal production and on coal use, how old your fleets are, how your general position is. So, but since the planetary boundaries are kind of fixed, it's physics, I guess as an international community, we have to live up to that challenge as an international community. And David, I didn't have that on my list, but since you just mentioned these border adjustment mechanisms, obviously it also means that in case the EU wants to introduce CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that has to be embedded in a diplomatic effort to talk to countries how to do that in a way that it is not protectionist, but actually something positive for the climate and not destructive. So I think that's diplomatically quite a fine line next to the WTO questions also, which can be resolved. So I think that should be a priority as well. Do I have still 2 minutes, Marina, or one? I do?
One.
Okay, then let me end with a positive note. Let me end with that. First, Nicholas Stern already more than a decade ago said, the cost of action are much lower than the cost of inaction. That's good news. Second, business starts to embrace opportunities, and there are tons of them. Renewables, green hydrogen, energy efficiency, and just on the side for things like new technologies like green hydrogen, we should, as an international community, also put standards and certifications so we know what we are talking about when we talk about that. And the IEA in their net zero scenario, I can commend them on doing one, said more jobs will be created than lost in this transition if we do it right. And the numbers are amazing, more than double the jobs created than lost. And that doesn't mean we don't have answers we need answers for those who are needing to transition in their jobs, which is, by the way, something which in business often happens. But we do have opportunities to create new business fields and jobs. So I think we can embrace this and build the future we want our children to live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camilla. I think that there are so many important issues you touched upon and reflected. Lots of things I would like to respond to. I will limit myself to just one clarification, because I think that the comment on lack of ambition in the Russian strategy was related to the draft strategy on low carbon development. And now we have moved forward, and yesterday our president announced officially the goal of reaching neutrality by 2060. And I think this is a major step forward, but I will not expand on this. I would like to invite Igor Makarov, who is head of the School of World Economy and head of the Laboratory for Economics of Climate Change at the High School of Economics, and a very well-known expert in the field of economics of climate change to reflect on these and maybe other issues as well?
Спасибо большое, Марина Владимировна. С вашего позволения я буду говорить по-русски, просто потому что большая часть аудитории у нас русскоязычная. И я
Thank you very much for introducing me, and let me speak. I hope you will allow me to speak Russian, as most of our audience speaks Russian. And let me just find my presentation. I hope you can see the slide. So today we heard a lot about the world becoming less carbon intensive, and the greenhouse gases emissions are shrinking, but that's not enough to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, Paris Charter. And still, it is a very uneven and asynchronous movement. And in my short presentation, in my brief presentation, I'd like to draw your attention to this manner, unevenness, asynchronousness, and this asymmetry between countries and group of countries causes slow down in addressing those goals. Let me identify three types of asymmetry, of different speeds of solution addressing the problem, which I believe to be very important. First is between the developed and developing countries. It's clear that more ambitious countries are in the developed sector, but they account for only 1/3 of global emissions, and this share is going down. And the whole dynamic of the emissions is grown by the developing countries, emerging countries, and this trend is going to be continued. So it doesn't matter if the European Union will reach carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060, but it's important how China and India and Indonesia and Nigeria and Pakistan develop. And we need to understand that, in fact, it's the developing countries, the emerging countries that will decide the climate destiny. And we mainly talk about the developed countries, but we need to pay more attention to developing, to emerging ones. On the other hand, this asymmetry lies in the fact that the emerging countries have more opportunities for cheap reduction of emissions. It's much cheaper to do it in the developing emerging countries. On one hand, we have developed countries with all the capital and the wish to cut the emissions, but there is no cheap options to cut the emissions. On the other hand, we have emerging countries which have many cheap opportunities to cut the emissions, but not enough capital and not enough tools to do that. I believe this is the key reason that stops us from improving the climate. So once we find the solution to that matter, it will be a great step forward in addressing that matter. And the second one, between the exporter and importers of carbon-intensive products. Mainly it's developed and emerging countries, but of a slightly different way. We have ambitious countries that want to cut emissions as soon as possible, but they import huge quantities of carbon-intensive products from other countries. And on the other hand, Russia, which is an exporter of carbon-intensive products. So look at Sweden, for instance. Usually we praise them for climate ambitious goals, for being so assertive in cutting the greenhouse gases and reaching the carbon neutrality earlier than others. But their carbon footprint is much over a Swede is much higher than that of a Russian. Because of the by imported goods. So it's it's explained by the imported goods they consume. So these flows should be considered, and it's not enough, it's not sufficient just to carbon body adjustment mechanism. It just reflects the part of the problem, but the problem is in the consumption, and the developed countries have huge consumption volumes, and in any case this consumption should find the goods, and the goods come from the emerging countries. And the more the European Union and other developed countries become carbon neutral, the higher the flows, the product flows will be to them. And now, speaking about the exporters of carbon intensive producer, well, we need to really see the origin of the goods. And the third type of asymmetry is between the emissions and addressing other problems of development, inequality and poverty. I agree with David, who spoke about these goals as not always conflict. I agree, it's not always, but in many cases, these are conflicting goals, and especially in the developed emerging countries. For instance, look at the countries, look at the inequality. Most of the burden of cutting the emissions will be borne by the relatively poor households. And the same goes for Russia. So the main problem is not to decarbonization is not problem, but what to do with the low prices for the heat and energy, which are part of the social contract and which are important for the well-being of the largest part of the population, which is rather poor. And we can see the same problem in China, Brazil, India, and other countries. So linking the problem of emission reduction and inequality is the key problem in the addressing the decarbonization goal. And let me try to come up with some solutions that should be considered to overcome this asymmetry. First, you need to, well, together with the calculation and estimation of the emissions, we need to account for and regulate the emissions on the basis of consumption, not just production, because production alone, if we try to regulate the emissions, it will not be sufficient to cut them. You need to regulate the emissions on the consumption side, and you require demand side climate instrument, and you need to account for them at the demand side, not at the supply side. You need to change the practices, the behavior, the link targeted at regulation of parameters of buildings, infrastructure, and everything that has to do with the end consumption. And those tools are targeted at linking the green agenda, climate agenda, with inequality, especially in cases those tools are applied with progressive taxation. So progressive taxing of income is the very tool that will allow to avoid higher inequality, which will come with the lower emissions. So you need to address both problems together, climate and inequality. And this is the only way to address each of those problems. And the third recommendation that I mentioned is building this system of global green financing and offsets. So you need to cut the emissions in places where it is the cheapest way. If you need to cut them in the emerging countries, it's better to do that exactly in the emerging countries. And so you need to link them to the global financial market with capital originating in other countries. You can do that through the developing market of green financing, green through offset system, green bonds, but you need to actually create the global green finance system from national systems that will never be able to find the cheapest option for reducing the emissions. And then the last but not the least is the technology transfer led by international institutions. I believe this is the most important element and one of the less dynamically evolving, and considering the fact that it's emerging countries that will decide the climate fate, but not the developed one. So this element of global regulation should get the highest attention and become a central element in the climate negotiations. I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Igor Alexeyevich. I want to tell you that you have drawn a very comprehensive and multifaceted picture, and even spoke about the solutions of the problems that you highlighted. And we have several conclusions that actually dovetail, that match our discussions today. Maxim Stanislavovich said that indeed we need to create something like a common global project law, project register, in the logic that's going to be most efficient for the client, for the climate, for each invested ruble or dollar. And certainly it will certainly direct the investment into the projects in developing countries, including Russia. It is very important to have them here too. And speaking about efficiency of cross-border pricing, we're talking about minimal global tax, carbon taxation from IMF, and Annette said that the cross-border mechanisms in the way they are offered now by EU are still inefficient just because they cover only limited volume, less than 10% of the emissions. So addressing this import and export asymmetry would certainly raise the efficiency of our collaboration. So it's a plethora of interesting considerations and solutions offered, but still, how does our system of global governance? We have been talking about it a lot for a long time, and you have been talking, and somehow this logic is still is not yet does not fit in the global governance.
Expand a little bit on this, on the problems of our global climate governance. My dear friend Ella Kakotsis, Director of Accountability, G20 and G8 Research Group, University of Toronto.
Hello, Marina. Can everybody hear me? I'd like to begin by saying spasibo bolshoi, thank you to you, Marina, and your team at RENEPA for the invitation once again to speak at this year's conference. I've really enjoyed being part of this annual tradition for the last 6 years, and I'm really hoping very much that we can reunite in person again, hopefully next year in Moscow. So in this session, we're talking about cooperation priorities for attaining climate and sustainable development goals. I think we can all agree, as we've already heard, that robust global governance is essential now more than ever in dealing with numerous global risks and setbacks, which have only been exacerbated by the impact of the pandemic over the past 20 months. Climate change is absolutely no exception, as it too presents major risks and international cooperation challenges. So to that extent, what can we realistically expect the Rome G20 summit to deliver on climate change when the leaders meet in about 2 weeks from now? And how will this impact COP26, which immediately follows thereafter? And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into these thoughts. Now, skeptics could argue, and convincingly so, I think in some cases, that expectations on climate change heading into Rome are quite low for a number of reasons. First, the G20 produced really very little on climate change following the Riyadh summit last year. Second, how will US political constraints? Despite Biden's good intentions, there are congressional limits. And these can obviously, hinder his aggressive climate agenda and place it at risk. So how is that all going to work? Third, can anything really substantive be achieved in the absence of Angela Merkel, who's been an international powerhouse on climate change over her 16-year tenure as Germany's chancellor? And of course, what about the continued reluctance, and I think this is key, of China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and India to take the necessary and bold climate controlling steps? But to this, I would like to offer today a counter perspective and suggest that the Rome G20 is in fact poised to produce a fairly significant performance on climate change for a number of reasons. If we look at Italy's priorities for its G20 presidency, people, planet, prosperity, climate change sits within the very top tier of these global issues, alongside the economy and global health. Italy has emphasized throughout its presidency a cross-cutting green agenda that stresses a more inclusive, a greener, and a smarter economic recovery. The Italians are also integrating sustainable finance into their financial stability framework by having central banks directly promote climate change control. They're also promoting the elimination of coal and fossil fuel subsidies. I know we've heard this before, many times before, and we also understand that there is strong opposition on this point from China and India. Nevertheless, the Italians are moving ahead on trying to get some concrete language into the communique on this. The Italians are also considering means by which to increase carbon taxation as a way of rapidly decarbonizing the global economy. But perhaps most importantly, in-person summitry is returning to Rome. And we all know and understand full well, particularly those of us who have been following the summits for so many years, the significance of having the leaders meet face to face as they work through some of these very complex international issues and problems, particularly those related to climate issues. So if that's the case, then what is the key driver that will push the G20 performance on climate change in Rome? I think the key really is the number of climate-related shocks across the G20 countries in the months prior to Rome, as Camila just pointed out to us. This past summer saw record high temperatures throughout Canada, unusually hot temperatures in the United States, Eastern Europe, across the Mediterranean, Western Russia, and of course, Siberia. By mid-July, extreme floods had killed, as we know, hundreds in Germany, Belgium, the UK, and throughout various regions of China. Major fires had devastated Greece and Turkey. And by the end of August, Hurricane Ida had left a trail of destruction in her path throughout various regions of the southeastern United States. And to top things off, as Camilla also pointed out, the latest IPCC assessment report released by the UN in August starkly warned that the climate crisis had reached alarming and in some cases irreversible levels. So given these extreme weather events, I think the G20 is highly motivated this year to provide the necessary momentum heading into Rome and then into COP. So what can we reasonably then expect coming out of the G20 and into Glasgow? Well, there's been a lot of hype, as we know, and international attention around this year's COP meeting, as it promises to see its most carbon-intensive members commit to major reductions, targets, and timetables. And delaying COP by a year, I think, was really significant because it gave countries time to work out their individual responses to the COVID emergency and reevaluate their commitments to shifting to a low-carbon economy. The delay also allowed time to develop new approaches to sustainability, in addition to giving President Biden a chance to reestablish US climate leadership. And like the G20, an in-person COP meeting, which is expected to attract close to 30,000 delegates, will facilitate bilateral and multilateral discussions in person, where tough decisions have to be made, and therefore physical presence really does matter, as it does at the G7, as it does at the G20. I think that the COP members, including the G20, will agree that a 1.5 supports and that efforts to get there must be made faster, now than ever before. I also suspect that COP will mobilize enough new climate finance and action on loss and damage so that developing countries will also agree to the deal. As well, the success of the US economic recovery, its strong climate focus and green infrastructure initiatives will also provide that upward convergence that spurs stronger climate performance in both Rome and in Glasgow. And I think importantly, COP26 will also be propelled by this uptick we've seen this year in other climate-related summits that happened earlier, including the One Planet Summit, the Climate Adaptation Summit, and of course, Joe Biden's Summit on Climate, all of which collectively served as strong building blocks in preparation for both Rome and Glasgow. Now, of course, I do sense that there are going to be certain limitations as we move into the next few weeks, particularly around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and global carbon pricing mechanisms. There may also be very little to no progress on ending fossil fuel subsidies and eliminating coal by specific medium-term date. We know there's been a lot of conflict around these issues. But we know that in terms of attendance, over 100 world leaders are currently scheduled to attend in person or virtually, including most of the G20. Performance, of course, at COP26 will heavily depend on the decisions made by its most powerful leaders and its worst polluters, with China at the helm. But there's been no confirmation to date, from what I can glean, on whether President Xi will actually be in attendance at COP in person or send a delegate. So that still remains to be determined. We can also expect to see other important figures and dignitaries, including Queen Elizabeth, who will meet and greet the leaders, the brilliant Sir David Attenborough, and of course, the very spirited Greta Thunberg. So the momentum on climate action is certainly mounting as we head into these next few weeks. And I think that momentum comes at a time when the planet absolutely needs it the most. And with that, I'll end my comments. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you very much, Ella. Again, lots of factors which could be, which could influence a positive impact. And of course, US leadership is important, but given what Igor said earlier, and given that the emerging market economies and developing countries account for a never-growing level of emissions and will continue to do so, and that the costs of cutting emissions in these countries are much lower, I would add one more point, a suggestion that we need the G20 and the COP to come in agreement on a global register of climate projects, which would be based on the economic calculations and climate calculations, so that investment goes to those projects which are most cost effective and work for the climate in a most effective way. Thank you, Ella. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Всеволод Valerianovich Gavrilov, because I think he has got very different perspectives, both from the business point of view and the government, and of course as an expert. Всеволод Gavrilovich, the floor is yours.
Спасибо большое, коллеги. Добрый день.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So I will speak Russian. Indeed, just I'm slightly taken aback, finding myself in this audience, and I feel a little bit shy because I'm not an expert on macro matters, unlike my colleague Igor. But my daily life is planning and designing of investment projects on micro and meso level, speaking about conglomerates. And so let me try to show my screen and give you some overviews and share some thesis which will help you.
Just a second, Actually, we need just to get you a certain idea of the processes we can see here. Let me remove. So there are some technical glitches I need to remove. So let's quickly. Let me start with the first part of it. You can see the screen. It's very important since it is true that Russia now has joined the so-called club of the states that commitments related to the reduction of emissions until 2060. Russia by 2060, Russia will be carbon neutral. So this is the this is goodwill, and this is our common value. And then the next point, then I want to point out to you is the issue related to decarbonization. So we took the information from the World Bank, and so then this is the carbon intensity of GDP and the carbon intensity of electrical energy, electric generation. And it means that we have much in common, because you see there are many countries, there are many curves, and this we have some common background. We have some benchmark they can move from, because we have much in common all around. And I've given you some most recent the most recent report of the international agency. And Igor was saying something very important. What does it mean to move to the trajectory of low carbon development for the developing and advanced economies? So for the emerging countries, so we can see the maintenance of certain trends and kind of either acceleration or slowing down of the dynamics. Then in the advanced, it's kind of the transfer. It's kind of spikes. So we call it a Russian, so you call them Russian hills, we call them American hills, etc. Because these American hills are quite dangerous from the viewpoint of investment processes. Because, you know, because at the micro level, so we love scissors and those slopes. Because slopes versus scissors is a conflict process. And so because they clash. Because I think that to overcome this, we'll need the interaction with technological transfer. The transfer of technologies, financial mechanisms will be required, financial resources, their availability, their fairness, and non-discriminatory nature of financial support. Now, money-wise, the same situation is there. So it's in Russian, but so then I will give just this understanding in English. So then bright yellow is the share of the EG financing in sectoral and ESG financing in the metallurgy and so this is 2020. And the top part of the column is the plan. Expectation about the share of ESG financing in 2025. So ESG financing is growing, and so the system is adapting, is calibrating to the new demand, and so the share is growing of ESG. I would like that to support, to echo David. David, from the very beginning, you said something very important, that the success of a green transfer to the real aggressive scenario of low carbon development is the issue of coordination of efforts. And this coordination of efforts is something that is expected from G20. It's what business community expects. And because I represent a business company, and because I work at this business company every day, and so they have practical issues. Yes, we are ready to invest. They say yes, we have sectoral goals, we have business goals, but don't just interfere with us. At least just don't stand in the way. Just help us, but don't. But if you don't, we don't even expect you to help us. But just don't stand in the way, and then we'll do this transfer. We are fully. And then I would like just to support and echo Igor, because if our main task that was set and it's related to address the global man-made influence on climate, then we need to allocate financial resources, technological and other types of resources in the sectors, in the regions where we can jointly get the maximum effect. Thank you. Thank you very much, Всеволод Valerianovich. I agree. It's very important that business sees profit in it, sees its interest in it, especially long term, because all these projects are related to the climate neutrality and green investments. It's a long term, strategic, all of them in their nature, and the rules of the game. They should be understandable and transparent long term as well. But we were saying that's what we were saying today. Another point is that people's support is important. So to achieve the goals that were proclaimed, and that means that there should be it should not be to the detriment of other sustainable development goals. It should not detriment SDG. Like fighting poverty, fighting over inequality, etc. So then we have constrained resources. It's true, and the most efficient projects and the most efficient cooperation and technologies and everything that we need to select to make the right choice, and on this basis build our joint work. And I know that in BRICS we had a number of attempts. So when we were under our chairmanship, we wanted to come out with the ideas that our speaker promoted. But what we need to understand, not only joint understanding between the developing countries and the new emerging markets, and so we need a global consensus as well. And I'm very happy to welcome you, Irina Zotov. Now over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Our discussion, let's put it like that, it's really the discussion, is very fruitful, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share the ideas that are extremely precious. I would like to stress several points concerning the priorities for BRICS sustainable development, and I know perfectly well that it's the end of our session and we have a definite time limit, so I'll try to be very quick. There are 10 priorities for our countries as we consider we should take them into consideration, and because all of our country members are interested in sustainable economic growth and effective risk management and moving along the road of reaching the goals of sustainable development. Every country has its own priority, and the first main issue is that while reaching the goals within the agenda for trade and economic development and other types of relations, we should certainly be linked together within the strategic partnership that gives us possibility for penetration to international trade relations, just gives the possibility to shorten the periods of affiliation and use technological administrative reserves more effectively. And that is why
taking it into consideration, we have different mechanisms within the direct and indirect financing. It goes without saying that we can do nothing without financing, and there are different forms of it, while moving the road as it can be concerning the setting the customs union, the mutual market, the economic union, and the banks play an extremely important role in this process. And the third priority is just the intergovernmental cooperation and fruitful relation of the banks with the participation of our member countries. The variety is great, and the possibilities for cooperation of Eurasian Union that is also extremely interested in double movement within the process of reaching the goals. And while serving the needs of our clients and of our customers, the banks should rely on just support of different governments in different trends of the activity that are presented to your kind attention, because they are extremely important at the moment, as well as the development of the mutual payment system on national currencies, payment system not only for BRICS countries, but also for Eurasian Economic Union partners and other partners who would like just to join the platform for settlements in national currencies. It is not difficult, generally speaking, because we all have a technological background. We only need the political will, the rules, and the main principles of the supervision and the functioning of the system. Actually, the problem of acceleration, the usage of national currencies is extremely important within our countries, and legislation is very it's just a key point, and just we know that it should be the economic demand. We consider that stock exchanges, we can put like that, the Stock Exchange Alliance at the moment of BRICS countries play an important role in acceleration of usage national currencies. And as far as the priority concerning the meeting the needs of cyber economy and cyber finance, there are different varieties of cybersecurity activity that should be one of the priorities of our countries, and it is very actual just in the global environment, because there are different types and models and mechanisms of cyber communication, but the problem of harmonization and the implementation of cyber vehicles to the usage within the contemporary economy, within innovations in commerce, trade relations, then the relations of our entities on different levels is extremely important. And we consider that it can be several trends of harmonization of relations at the very beginning within the market, environment, operations, reporting, supervision, and the question of hydrogen economy today was discussed, and because it's our future, and any country participates in this or some other aspects in this process, in production green hydrogen at the moment, and there are different types of others, and there are a lot of challenges in this respect. Within the BRICS, we consider that it's the huge long-term project that can be successfully just introduced to practice on the basis of private-public partnership with...
Да, привет. Нормально. Сижу тут, дымлю уже вторую неделю, готовлю материалы к совещанию.
Pilot projects and just...
Или какой Глазго? Кабрамчик на вторник?
Will you be so kind as to switch?
Ну, нет, смотри, во вторник будет очень...
Somebody is interfering with its private discussion. Oh, thank you very much. Indeed. While reaching the goals of hydrogen economy, let's put it like that, it's very important at the very beginning to set up the intergovernmental consortium, just the intergovernmental one, because private entities probably will not afford themselves, just without any privileges, priorities that can be given by the governments just to fulfill the project within the hydrogen economy goals. I have already mentioned the possibility of public-private partnership and the key aspects for our cooperation that I would like to mention that is very attractive is just the democratic approach of our partner countries to restructuring, to implementation some new models into practice. Then the desire of provision of intergovernmental administration and several steps that are indicated in the documents of our countries. And there is the possibility of stimulation of cooperation of the entities and the general support of the government in this respect. Thank you very much indeed.
Спасибо большое, Ирина Зотовна. Действительно, в БРИКС...
Irina Zottovna, thank you so much, because it's true that BRICS has a very wide agenda. And so the issues of climate change, unfortunately, they don't occupy as much space in the agenda as they should occupy in the Big Five. And the prospects of expanding this BRICS agenda important for BRICS. For the BRICS, for the Big Five, and for the global task of achieving SDG goals. We actually, our time is up. But I like to thank all the participants of the panel for very fruitful, interesting, and vibrant presentations. And there is one question from the previous panel that was dedicated to the sustainability of the international monetary system. And so then we have to discuss it, and about the role of capital flows and how. So then we spoke about it. How the private capital flows and the financial capital markets flows that exist in the market that turn there. So how they can be motivated to go into green bonds, green projects, how just to migrate them, to divert them into those goals, and how. Thus we could ensure the participation of private capital in priority projects. A long question, and I would like to very briefly comment. David or Igor or Vsevolod Gavrilovich, could you quickly, very shortly comment concerning this issue? Всеволод Gavrilovich spoke about that because he said that the EU is developing a reporting taxonomy of projects. Reporting is important. There's responsible financing in this sphere, etc. The EU is working on it. I would give the floor to Igor, and because he's better prepared. And I think there are no methodological problems. They don't exist. At the level of communications and business, we interact very well with our colleagues, the business champions, the United States, the EU, Canada. Everything is clear. We understand each other very well. But the issue is mostly in the coordination at the G20 level. Of the solutions, decisions that we need to develop methodologically. So financially, like service, IT, digital service, they work very well. So don't look for problems where there are no problems. The problem is it's goodwill coordination. Igor, over to you. I think that I would support what you said. It's good. There are no technical problems. So then transboundary, so cash flows would support green agenda, no problem. But in different countries, different systems of regulation, and not always they motivate so the capital flows between the countries. So what in the EU, for example, they practically stopped accept foreign offsets so for their own climatic goals. So they stopped doing that, and so to carry out the tasks that about the emissions that the quotas that they get. So that's a good specific question example. So we need to work more about coordination of the systems of regulations, because it's even more important than running after ambitious tasks. Because we have seen this parade of ambitions. That's what we see here. So some of them are grounded, some are ungrounded. So this parade of ambitions. But that's because goal settings, which will be accomplished, performed when there will be different politicians, it's just beside the point. But the regulation in different countries, so a building system of international financing and regulation to do that coordination is just much more important than setting those goals. Yes, for 2030, 2050, we need just to get the foundation. And it is true that I mentioned about the necessity of harmonization of regulation, so the risk optimization, etc., optimization of activities of all stakeholders, because they don't understand when and how they will work. But then another point is to determine the priorities, because you won't force a business to work where it does not think it's profitable to work, because its purpose is profit. And profit can be obtained differently. And that is why if it would be feasible, if we talk about the development of a certain industry that would be of global interest for everyone. And so we need to understand the governments on the territories of whom this project will be accomplished. And so this is defined for the participants, for interested. If business understands, because ideology is a good thing, but goals of business are quite different. And that's why you would take if the capital owners, investors, if they understand it's of interest to them, they will definitely come. And but talking empty talk's no good.
David, would you like to add anything to this?
David, would you like to?
An important factor in stimulating investment into green bonds, green projects, and climate-related objectives.
Thank you. I think there's already been a lot of very good remarks made. I can agree that there is a large amount of finance, in the private sector available, and it's really the private sector that is going to catalyze these changes. And it's a matter of providing the regulatory signals, the certainty, the understanding of how to invest in Russia, and also for a role for the authorities to use public policy smartly to address market failures to ensure that these markets do develop. In certain cases, it's not only on the supply side, but also on the demand side. There may be a role for the government in its typical role as public service provider of public goods to address market failures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Уважаемые коллеги, мы немножко перебрали по времени, но я думаю, что содержание дискуссии
that we are a little bit behind time, but I think that the discussion justifies that, and I'd like to thank all the speakers and participants. We need to talk more about the priorities on all sides. Voice are concerned, and that's the right time we expect for important decisions. But I'm afraid that the optimism that Ella has may not be fully justified. But if the decisions that we're expecting so badly, if they are not taken, if they're not made, because we need still to continue and move forward in spite of anything. It's on all planes, national, regional level, everywhere. We need to persevere. All dimensions are important, but the most important part is that to balance, to achieve all goals in a balanced fashion. Yeah, naturally, climatic, yes, climate-related goals. Yeah, they are of extreme importance, and for the achievement of other corollary goals. But the social contract with the citizens can help in achieving the goals of others is the priority that we cannot shrug off. And I'd like to thank all the participants, and I hope that tomorrow and we meet again and for other meetings. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Элла. Все, да, у нас идет запись еще.